Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive, and it's time to see what's making the headlines with political journalist at the Financial Times, Jasmine Cameron, Chileshe, and the political editor with The Sun, Harry Cole. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you. And the front of the eye looks at pressures on the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt to boost defence spending or risk failing to deter Putin. The Daily Mail also addresses defence questions with its headline, Rishi, RAF are ready to shoot down spy balloons. As Sarah Everard's killer pleads guilty to charges of indecent exposure, the front of The Guardian says that police missed chances to arrest Cousins as sex offender suspect. In the Financial Times, overseas bets on Vodafone mount as Liberty Global takes a £1.2 billion stake. That's their headline. The Metro leads on family tributes to 16-year-old Brianna Joy, who was stabbed to death in a park in Cheshire on Saturday. The headline, strong, fearless, one of a kind. And the front of The Sun looks at the energy company Utility Warehouse, which has reportedly sent 100 of its reps on an all-expenses-paid trip to the Maldives, of course, during the cost of living crisis. And the headline on the front of the Daily Mirror quotes a recently released convicted murderer. I'm not a threat to victim's lover, it says. As you know, we're joined tonight by Jasmine Cameron, Chileshe, and Harry Cole. And very good evening to you, of course, and let's dive straight in. Quite a mixed bag, isn't it, this evening? But this story that's got everyone mystified, well, the British dimension now, the balloons and objects, including small cars, apparently floating over North America. This on the front of the Daily Mail, Jasmine. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, saying the RAF are ready to shoot down spy balloons. Well, you kind of would have expected them to be anyway, wouldn't you?
Yeah, so it's quite bold language from Rishi Sunak. So he was asked about the escalating tensions between the US and China. We know over the past few days, the US military have shot down several objects that have been flying over North American airspace that they claim have been Chinese spy balloons. And so this is Rishi Sunak attempting to weigh in and also reiterate the fact that the UK obviously is willing to do whatever it takes in order to protect its airspace as well. But I also think it comes at a time where Sunak is under a lot of pressure from his own MPs to take a toughened stance against China. And we know that we are waiting on the government's integrated review, looking into the direction of the UK's security strategy. And so it was a message not only to China and to other Western allies, but it was also a message to his own backbenchers that he's very comfortable and very willing to talk tough on China and to also signal that the UK isn't going to back down when it comes to international threats.
It's interesting, though, the length of time it's all been going on. This also in the article and in other papers as well, Harry. The White House confirmed that China is running a high-altitude balloon program to collect intelligence. And a quote from John Kirby of the US National Security Council, these surveillance balloons have crossed over dozens of countries on multiple continents, including some of our closest allies, including presumably the United Kingdom. And people will be asking, well, why have we been letting it go on?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that the Prime Minister today, when he was asked, he sort of led very heavily on the tradition that he wouldn't comment on the actual specifics. He ducked behind national security to say behind his tough rhetoric whether we had actually been targeted. I think the spy balloon is an interesting one. That was the size of 3 double-decker buses. The 4 objects that have been shot down in more recent days have actually been some smaller than a car. It's not necessarily clear they even are spy satellites, and they've been taken out as a sort of abundance of caution, as one of the US generals said. Look, the United States, I was reading today, had 45,000 different planes flying in and out of the United States airspace every day. That's just commercial. Then you've got thousands of military flights. Then you've got classified flights that don't even show up on radar. These things are quite small. It's in a very, very busy airspace. And I think they're only really seeing them now because they're really looking for them. There's no doubt, though, that they've clearly been caught off guard, if it is true, that this new front in the sort of battle against China and hostile states such as Russia and Iran has taken on a bizarre, and it's a slightly dated term. We haven't really been talking about hot air balloons and sort of airships for many decades now. So perhaps I think while the world was focused in the cyberspace sphere and then in the sort of hypersonic sphere. Actually, perhaps we've taken our sort of foot off the accelerator in studying some more traditional ways of spying on each other, which is putting up a balloon. Now, as Jasmine said, Sunak's in an interesting position here because he has got this defence review coming up, in which he has been resisting privately a further classifying China as a threat to Britain. At the moment, it's considered a systematic competitor. Now, a creature of the Treasury such as Rishi Sunak wants to keep as much trade open with China as possible. But this is going to make it really, really hard for him to justify that. And it couldn't have come at a sort of worse time for the British government, as they're just about to have a big fight, with, as Jasmine said, with their backbenchers about why they're not going to be even tougher than they already are on China.
OK. Let's have a look at the front of The Guardian. Plenty of different stories on that, but we want to concentrate on, of course, the terrible earthquake, or earthquakes, I should say, as the UN says today, that at this phase, a week on after the earthquake, it's now perhaps a little bit more about dealing with those who survived, helping those who survived, rather than looking for those who may be still trapped under the rubble. And the headline, Desperation in Idlib as Earthquake Compounds Syria's Crises. And of course, that being plural, Jasmine, because we all know what's been going on for the last 12 years. It's very difficult in those circumstances to get aid to those people.
Certainly, and you feel desperately sorry for these individuals who, as you allude to, have been, there's been lots of geopolitical tensions and upheaval in that region, and then to have a natural disaster on top of that. And a week on from the actual earthquake, we're now getting these harrowing stories about the struggles of survivors trying to access aid, trying to rebuild their lives after what has been a terrible tragedy. And I think the questions will be on the international community, looking at what can be done tangibly to make sure aid is getting to those people in need, to look at what amounts countries need to be giving. We know that a lot of countries like the UK, for example, are looking at their budgets are under tight constraints, but will also want to make sure they're adhering to their international obligation and their humanitarian obligation to help in a situation like this. But, the newspapers have been filled with some of the images and some of the stories, and it is just heartbreaking. And hoping that the international community can find a way to make sure aid gets to those in need, and so people can start rebuilding their lives.
Harry, what do you make of it? I mean, particularly the difference between what we're able to get into Turkey and those benighted Syrian people who, in some cases, have been just left to deal with it on their own.
Yeah, no, completely. Look at Turkey. It's touching the shores of Europe. It's a NATO country. We've had our differences in the past, but obviously we've been able to get there quickly. Visa access for rescue teams, firefighters, specialist crews that us and other countries have donated very rapidly. And then you've got the absolute basket case of geopolitics that is Syria. In the rebel-held areas, you've got the Russian influence. You've got Russian mercenaries on the ground. You've got a sort of leper government in Damascus that the international community really does not want to touch after the horrific crimes of the last 10 years. And it plays into a wider, geopolitical problems. Relations with Russia are in the deep freeze in a way we haven't seen for decades, since the end of the Cold War. How are people going to come together and work around it? And if suddenly you're talking to the Russians about what to do in getting aid into Syria, why not talk to the Russians about other matters? It's going to really play into lots of other currents around the world, and the clock is ticking. The death toll alone, 33,000 now. The Red Cross saying they expect that to, the UN saying they expect that to double, making it one of the worst earthquakes in recorded history. But then look at the numbers of displaced people. Not only people already displaced by the war in Syria pouring into Turkey, but millions and millions of people left homeless in freezing temperatures and time running out.
Absolutely, Harry. You put that perfectly. I'm going to stay with The Guardian, top of The Guardian. And I mean, Jasmine, what do you make of this? I mean, it is shocking. Police missed chances to arrest Cousins as a sex offender suspect. We know about his murder of Sarah Everard, but just 6 days before he kidnapped her, Cousins exposed himself at a fast food drive-through restaurant on the London and Kent border. And get this came up when he pleaded guilty today. Staff reported the incident to the Metropolitan Police with the full car registration and details from the credit card he paid for food with. The car was registered to him. It's jaw-dropping.
I mean, it is truly shocking, and it does make you wonder what sort of processes are in place by the Metropolitan Police to ensure that if there is an incident where an officer has been flagged as perhaps committing a crime or flagged an incident like this, surely there should have been some sort of practices in place where it was investigated properly, he wasn't still on the streets. And as we know, if we look at the timeline of when he committed these offences, it was in February 2021, as you say, just a few days before he murdered Sarah Everard. And so it does really feel like there was a missed opportunity. And I think it comes at a time when there's a lot of public questioning over the Met. Obviously, there are a lot of individuals who serve dutifully. It's an incredibly stressful job, but we know there have been a handful of stories that have touched upon a culture of misogyny, touched on issues of race that have been identified. And so these sorts of stories, it doesn't really instill a lot of confidence in the force. And it does speak to the fact that I think there's a general feeling among the public, among certainly some elements of the government and Home Office, that there needs to be a little bit of a shake-up in terms of how the Metropolitan Police works, how it trains its officers, and how it picks up when there have been instances where an officer is engaged in misconduct, and what processes are conducted in order to make sure that they're off the streets and the case is handled properly.
Harry, can we have confidence that the Metropolitan Police can deal with this? I mean, the Commissioner says, it's something like 1,000 of his officers that need to be looked at, re-vetted and dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, not really, realistically, at the moment. It's going to find Mark Rowley himself, the Commissioner, says he understands that any woman in London now is going to have extreme scepticism of the Met. There comes a point that cleaning out the stables becomes so horrific, and lifting the lid on things becomes so sort of traumatic for people that actually the sheer scale of the number of problems in the Met perhaps could tip it over into a place that hasn't been for a long time. There's been discussions in the last few weeks with ministers, MPs, and it's sort of beginning to realise actually perhaps they're into a sort of tipping point that's been reached. That actually the Met is too big. It has too many responsibilities, ranging from serious fraud to terrorism to murder, in a city that's it could be easily broken up into smaller police forces that could be more accountable. I think the most chilling thing in that Guardian piece as well is the fact that not only did they miss him 6 days before, but they missed him before he even joined the Met. When Cousins was a nuclear constabulary officer, he had been reported for an indecent exposure in a forest in Kent, where he was a witness saw him half naked jumping out of the bushes. They saw his car, they reported his number plate, and crucially, this was given to the Met. The incident was reported to the Met when he tried to switch over from being from the nuclear constabulary to the Metropolitan Police. It was flagged, and the Met decided there wasn't enough evidence. It was an unproven allegation, and allowed him to join the police force just on the back of that. It's astonishing how lax it seems that recruitment for policemen in the Metropolitan Police has been, and no wonder they're in that mess that there are 1,000 cases that need reviewing if they let anyone in.
Yeah, and Jasmine, the chilling thought about that is that it's not about them messing it up and being lax, that there's something else in play there.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it speaks to how certain crimes are perceived. Because, say, for example, a lot of charities and activists have said that something like indecent exposure, for example, isn't really taken seriously by the police or by forces and authorities more generally. It's not seen as one of the more serious crimes, whereas actually it reflects on, perhaps the how an individual conducts themselves, how an individual perceives women, and can lead to more violent behaviour. And so it speaks to how certain crimes against women are also seen as well, because one report of indecent exposure should have been enough to set off red flags, but it's clear that didn't happen in this case.
OK, listen, we're going to take a short break now. Jasmine, Harry, thank you very much indeed for the time being. Coming up, we have the cost of living it up. Reports in The Sun claiming that an energy firm flew 100 of its reps to the Maldives on an all-expensive paid trip. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now are Jasmine Cameron, Chileshe, and Harry Cole discussing everything that's turning up in the studio here. And your paper, Harry, front page, a bit of a classic headline, cost of living it up. As Brits struggle with bills, and energy bosses send 100 reps to the Maldives, complete with a picture of, I must say, not modestly sized swimming pool there of some of the reps cooling off. Tell me about the story. Outrage at the firm. What is the firm?
The firm is a firm called Utility Warehouse, and part of their sort of incentives for staff, if they sign up lots of customers to their tariffs, they get flown out to the Maldives, it seems. I think the story has mainly come from holiday makers who've been pretty shocked to discover on the beach all of these reps from the company. One witness saying they were handing out business cards and chatting about how good business was, which at a time when energy companies rank pretty low down the ranks of popular industries at a time with sky-high prices, seems remarkably tin-eared thing to do. And it just kind of shows, along with the sort of sky-high profits of BP and Shell, the energy producers, and the companies that, have not really covered themselves in glory in the last few years, being forced kicking and screaming into putting, the most vulnerable people onto the lowest tariffs legally. It's just a real kick in the teeth for punters and bill payers at a time when worry about what to do about energy prices. Yes, the cost of energy is coming down, but it's still far higher than anyone's used to. And Jeremy Hunt making lots of noise ahead of the budget that the very generous energy support that customers have had over the last year is not going to last forever. So bills will be going up this year, not up as much as originally feared. But when you see pictures like this, you can understand the public's anger. And
still clearly judging on that, a lot of money to be made out of it all. Let's go to the Daily Telegraph. And Jasmine, Brexit deal weeks away. It reports as negotiators have solved the protocol row. Really? Do you think they have? This is, of course, the Northern Ireland protocol. It's been a thorn in the side of relations between the EU and the UK, well, ever since Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an optimistic story in the Telegraph, although there have been lots of briefings and front page stories about a deal is on the table, a deal is just days away. So there has been a lot of this in recent weeks. And, despite that, I think there is a genuine sense within Brussels that actually the Rishi Sunak's administration perhaps is more open to compromise. There is an element of the UK left the EU and we had the referendum in 2016. This has been dragging out for a very long time now, and there is a sense of urgency to actually get this over the line. There's also pressure from the Americans, and there's a feeling that this needs to be done ahead of the Good Friday Agreement anniversary. But ultimately, as I said, these stories have been floating around for days and weeks, and I think we'll have to wait and see if we have actually reached the final moment of crunch talks, or whether this is just slightly optimistic.
OK, well, let's take it at face value that we have. And then, Harry, perhaps the biggest hurdle then is getting it past the ERG within the Conservative Party and, of course, the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. We're already hearing, aren't we, the words sellout.
Well, something as Jasmine will know, and you will know, that, having covered Brexit for 6 years, just because you've got a deal in your hand, as Theresa May found out, with the European Union, and something you could bring back home and put to MPs, means actually you've now, that's when the politics of this really begins. This, almost the easy bit is getting the deal with the EU. It's getting it through Parliament that is the problem. Now, I think the ERG are less of a threat, actually, than the DUP. If the DUP give this the nod, which I'd be surprised if they did, I can't see the ERG holding out, the Tories holding out, if the actual Ulstermen whose livelihoods this is affecting on a day-to-day basis say it's okay. Now, this is all going to come down to the oversight of European judges. Now, the EU will say, actually, no, the ECJ remains the ultimate arbiter of disputes within Northern Ireland, and the Brits will be able to say, well, actually, no, local judges in Northern Ireland will be able to do the vast majority of disputes about trade rules or any fallouts. But ultimately, the ECJ will still have some input. Now, the Telegraph article says that this is something that Boris Johnson resisted and Liz Truss resisted. Boris Johnson, certainly, yes, but I think even in those 49 days of Liz Truss negotiating with the EU and her role as Foreign Secretary before that, I think that role for the ECJ was always going to be on the table. Now, that is a red line for the DUP. However, they did accept, in the original terms of Boris Johnson's divorce agreement, some input from the ECJ. So I wonder whether there'll be a landing zone there if it looks a lot like the other withdrawal agreement.